All right. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. I'm going to get right to it. Our first author is going to be Tae-Ping Chen. She's a journalist and a fiction writer. She's here today to talk about her debut book of short stories, Land of Big Numbers.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and to meet everyone, such that we can anyway. I grew up in Oakland, California, and as a teenager, I just remember discovering Moe's and Cody's and Shakespeare and Co. And just feeling like they opened up my world and like they were like the coolest and most rebellious places on the planet. So thank you so much for what you do. Um, Here to talk about my book, Land of Big Numbers. Which is a collection of short stories that is mostly set in China, where I was a reporter for a number of years, but also partly in Berkeley, one of them. And yeah, I mean, I think, as we all know, China is a place that often is seen so much as a monolith, especially now with this unremitting spate of headlines. And I think, for me, what I'm really hoping is that this book can just help folks see some of the humanity and get to appreciate more of, its charm, its beauty, its quirks, as well as its frustrations and the repression and authoritarianism, which we are so familiar with from the headlines. For me, what brought me to these stories was personal. I grew up in Oakland, California. While I'm ethnically Chinese, I was born in the US. And I guess you could say on both sides of my family, both my mother's and father's, we come from the losing side of Chinese history. On my mother's, they were Beijing intellectuals. On my father's, they were with the Kuomintang, which is the party that lost to the communists during the Civil War. And so while I grew up in a household that was very much steeped in a deep appreciation of what it meant to be Chinese and surrounded with artifacts of that heritage, scroll paintings and porcelain from my grandparents, that kind of thing. In fact, actually, no one in my family had been to China in a generation. Something that astounded me when I finally figured that out. And when I was in high school, I did tell my dad that I wanted to go, and he forbade me, basically. I was a feisty, opinionated teenager, and he said, no, you'll go, you'll just shoot your mouth off and land in jail. As it happens, I did make my way there eventually when I was in college. This was in 2006, and I was just miserable. This was, Beijing in the dead of the winter. It was incredibly bleak. I was living in kind of the outskirts of the city in this Soviet-style apartment block, and it just felt like looking around, this gray monolith of a city, like a place where history and heritage had been wiped clean. I had always been told that my grandmother had been raised in a traditional courtyard home and sort of part of Beijing's traditional architecture, the fabric of the city. But by the time I had arrived in Beijing, most of those had been destroyed. And I just remember wandering through the rubble, feeling profoundly sad. And by the time I left, just very much feeling like I hated the place and never wanted to return. I did go back a number of years later. This time was on assignment with the Wall Street Journal. This was in 2012, and I was really apprehensive about going back, just given how miserable I had been in Beijing all those years ago. But as it happened, I found that role of being a journalist really changed my experience and relationship with the country. It allowed me, instead of having this emotional, really visceral reaction to the place, just helped me focus on trying to understand the place and people. And I traveled all over and met everyone from striving college students to elderly farmers to human rights lawyers, some of whom appear in the book. And I really came to love the country. And all told, if you add it up, I've lived in China longer than anywhere else, except for my hometown. And it's a place I truly do love. And now, especially looking around, seeing the way that the two countries are being split farther and farther apart, I'm genuinely scared. And so I hope, this is a book that comes at a time when maybe it can make a little bit of a difference. It's a book that straddles a mix of styles, from realism to surrealism. The story is from a pair of twins who take different paths, one who becomes a professional video gamer, and then one who becomes a political activist and ends up jailed. to stories that are more surreal in tone, like one about a fruit that arrives in a Beijing neighborhood that triggers powerful emotions and memories and ends up changing lives and relationships. I had a lot of fun writing it. It's, I think my publisher's cover does a beautiful job of trying to sort of capture what I'm attempting to do in the collection, to break the place down and really convey it in a more nuanced, layered way. The other thing I would say is just looking back now, I think the chance to have written the book really already, even though it was not that long ago, already feels like it was part of, a different era. Very much, part of a lost world. Though I left Beijing, gosh, is it not even 2 years ago? Already, if I'd stayed much longer, I would have been kicked out, like, my colleagues and like many others at American newspapers. It's, people say like you can't step in the same river twice. And looking back at my time in China, I just feel like that's more true than anywhere other place on the planet. China is very much that way. And I think we've seen the way that the relationships have changed so quickly here in the US too. And so I mean, I just really hope that this collection can help remind people of the humanity on the other side. I also think, it's a time that many of us feel tethered in place. And I hope that this is a book that also just allows people to have that sense of pleasure and play that comes in exploring another country. There's a lot of good food in the book too. So yeah, that is Land of Big Numbers. Thank you so much for the chance to share.
Thank you, Tae-Ping. Now I want some fruit that'll change my life. Next, we have Brenda Paynado. Look at that background she's got. That looks amazing. She is a multi-award winning writer, and she's here to talk about her first collection of stories, The Rock Eaters.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. It looks like Tae-Ping and I were paired well, because I also have a debut collection that's genre spanning. But I want to say I'm really excited to be here talking to indie booksellers. My husband and I actually were married at an indie bookstore, and these were the boutonnieres from our wedding. So it's close to our hearts. So I'm here to talk about The Rock Eaters. It's genre bending and genre crossing. It's got elements of science fiction and fantasy, fabulism and magical realism, spans sort of worlds and dimensions. In terms of what they're tackling, though, they're often tackling things that are closer to home. So anywhere from class differences and immigration to first generation experiences and xenophobia. My parents are both from the Dominican Republic, and I lived there for a time and spent lots of summers going back there. So yeah, we were paired really well, I think. So I have, I think my experience with these sort of genre crossing stories is often comes from that feeling of being in between places and sort of always being ripped from one world and thrown into another and sort of seeing it with startled eyes, and then being ripped back to another world and sort of seeing that a place that I had called home before and sort of being startled by it anew. And I think that's where a lot of my sense of wonder and startlement and marvel comes from, even in stories that are talking about two girls alone in a basement talking about love. And that kind of thing. So my stories tend to feature Latina women and girls, but also wilder things like aliens, ghosts, superheroes, virtual realities, and angels falling from the sky. And then something that's more of an exaggeration, like the greatest recluse in Santo Domingo. They're all sort of exploring the themes of what does it mean to love in this flawed world? And what does it mean to fight for that love and for each other, even when we've been objectified, othered, and misunderstood? So a lot of times my stories, I've got a lot of stories where people are trying to find love, explain love, explore love, but also stories where they know that before they can even get there, they have to fight for something. So there's a lot of political stories in there too. Things like, for the more political stories, I have one about a a country that elects a mysterious leader that promises to make the country better. And then people realize that pieces of their bodies are going missing, and the leader's hoarding their eyes, their ears, and their lungs for himself. That one was written just after the last election. I also have stories like two suburban girls grappling with the school shooting in a world where their families pray to these angels that perch just outside their chimney on every roof, trying to get something to protect them from the world's violence. And so these two girls are sort of struggling to understand, like, what does protection really mean and who's being saved from whom? I have a story about a generation of flying prodigals and who come back to the island they emigrated from, who have a showdown with their kids, who don't want to fly and start eating rocks to keep themselves grounded, which is where the title, The Rock Eaters, comes from. I also have stories that are more about exaggeration, but also confrontation, and that sort of sense of confronting the real and the strange. So I have a group of Latina high school girls that confront the whitest girl they've ever seen at the biggest quinceañera of the year, and a young high school janitor that falls in love with her. So it's sort of told from a we perspective, where all the girls are looking at this whitest girl they've ever seen, sort of with that sense of strangeness. I also have some stories that, lots of them about girls sort of grappling with things. So besides that one, there's Yaitza, which is about a tennis playing rivalry from between girls from two opposite sides of the track. And that one sort of deals very heavily with class difference. And when I was a teen, I went to a tennis academy where all of the teens were trying to go professional. And so the story is really like me examining the idea of, like, that you can earn a win, and what does it mean to earn something when there's so much privilege involved. So stories like that. And then there's also sort of my more political, magical stories, like The Radioactives is the last story in that collection. And it sort of creates a new myth of Latin American superheroes. So after a group of anti-narcotic agents end up exposed to radiation, they develop superpowers and end up embroiled in a struggle between Latin America and the US. So this story is sort of the finale to the book. And in that finale, they storm the US border, sort of asking, are we monsters or are we heroes? And that story actually came from, I worked with someone who was an operator on one of these anti-narco trucks that the US sent to Venezuela, and with faulty radiation shield to the X-ray truck. And he ended up getting exposed to radiation and having to get flown out to hospitals and everything. And I usually take that kernel of truth and then ask, like, what would happen if it was wilder, if it was magical, if it was even more wondrous? So in that one, it's, well, what if this was an origin story to a superhero, and that superhero was Latin American? Who would they be trying to save? And then I have something that maybe is a little too close to home in the pandemic, but a story called The Touches, about a woman in a world where pandemics have driven humanity into little quarantine boxes and virtual reality. I know, I'm sorry. The main character and her husband have just elected to have a child. So in VR, her avatar is pregnant, but in real life, every human is sort of alone in their own box, and her baby's in a test tube. So the story's about discovering what lengths they're willing to go to feed their hunger for human contact, and grappling with that legacy of hunger that they're going to pass on to their child. So weirdly, since writing that story, I wrote it before the pandemic happened, and then the pandemic happened. And then I got an Oculus Quest this summer. So I actually spent a lot of my quarantine summer in virtual reality playing lightsaber dojo and battling droids. And then I got pregnant. So it's sort of retroactively autobiographical. So those are just a few of my stories, but ultimately I want my stories to cross borders and break walls in big ways, both politically and sort of in the heart. And I want them to feel like an investigation of humanity, sort of what's terrifying about us, what's marvelous, and what's worth saving. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brenda. All that sounds really, really fascinating and scarily and eerily real to what's going on right now. And congratulations on being pregnant.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Up next, we have Sally Hepworth. She is a best-selling author of 6 novels. She'll be talking about her forthcoming thriller, The Good Sister, which sounds excellent.
Thank you. I was just going to say, Brenda, can you please write about a cure to the virus or a vaccine? That would be wonderful, because it sounds like the truth is imitating fiction a little bit there. Get on to that. No, I'm here to talk about my new novel, The Good Sister, which is a bit of a hybrid of Eleanor Oliphant and Gone Girl. But before I tell you about that, I'm going to tell you a bit about my inspiration for the book, starting with a little confession, which is that I don't actually have a sister. I know. I don't know why I wrote about sisters when I don't have a sister, but I can explain. In fact, I think it's partly the fact that I don't have a sister that has made me so fascinated by sisters. I have been surrounded by them all my life. My mum is one of 5 sisters. Every one of my best girlfriends has got a sister, and recently, not that recently, 5-6 years ago, I became the mother of 2 sisters. So I've had a chance to watch this relationship up close for quite a while. And it was actually my little daughters who inspired this book. And I remember the moment that I decided to write the book quite clearly, because something really unusual was happening in our house, and that was that my daughters weren't fighting. So that's kind of a once a year event in our household. And I remember sitting outside watching them play, and it was just so wonderful. You know, there were squeals of joy, and they were sharing, and they were, you know, saying nice things to each other. It was so strange. And I actually thought to myself, maybe I'll go into the house and do something for myself. You know, I'll read a book, or, you know, do some day drinking, as I've been doing a lot of lately. And I had barely finished formulating that thought when the squeals of joy turned to those other nasty, awful kinds of squeals that say that someone has been injured. So this is what happens when a parent decides to do something for themselves. So I naturally went to investigate the squeals. And when I did, I found that my older daughter, Eloise, had a ring of teeth marks in her arm. There's something so shameful about biting, isn't there, as a parent? So naturally, my reaction was to reprimand my younger daughter, my 2-year-old daughter, who was standing there looking pretty proud of her handiwork. But the moment I started to do that, Eloise, who was the injured party, threw her arms around Clementine and said, "Don't you yell at my baby sister." And I was so confused by this, because as someone who grew up with 2 older brothers, I can tell you that there was no greater joy in my life than when my brothers got in trouble. In fact, still at 40 years old, I am now, when mum tells them off, I mean, life's good. And so it got me thinking that there's something different about sisters, isn't there? It's different between brothers and sisters, or even friends. There's this kind of magnificent love, but there's also this kind of treachery and this kind of, I don't know, possessiveness that says that while you can hurt your sister, no one else can. So it was that little seed that I took. From that moment, I walked away and I went to my office and I started writing notes for the book that would become The Good Sister. But this is not my daughter's story. As devilish as they are, they don't have quite enough life experience yet to make a whole novel. So I had to come up with a couple of fictional sisters. And so I came up with Fern and Rose, who are twin sisters, who are incredibly close, not just because they're twins, but also because they have shared a really difficult, pretty harrowing childhood together. But they've come through it, and now at 28, they're doing pretty well. Rose is the responsible sister. She's married, she has a great job, she has the house with the white picket fence, and she has plans to have a baby as soon as she can. Then there's Fern. Fern is the quirky sister. She's a single librarian. She is probably on the Asperger's spectrum, but she hasn't been diagnosed. But her sensory issues cause her to shy away from bright lights, from crowds, and to lead a fairly narrow life and lean quite heavily on her sister for assistance to live her life. And so at the start of the book, when Fern discovers that Rose can't have the baby that she yearns for, Fern sees her chance to pay her sister back for all of the wonderful things that she has done for her. And unbeknownst to Rose, she takes it on herself to try and have a baby for her, starting with a mission to find a father for that baby. And so in the library, she meets Wally, who is a possibly homeless man with a host of his own issues, some of them quite similar to Fern's. And as the pair of them develop a friendship and a beautiful connection, it starts to force Fern to look at the life that she's been living and wonder if, in fact, it was for her best interests. And it also makes her look at her relationship with her sister, and specifically at a secret that they have been keeping since they were 12 years old. So the book is funny and heartwarming, but it's also goes to some dark places like narcissism and also sexual assault. It's probably the kind of book you'd find on the shelves near Leanne Moriarty books, Lisa Jewell, maybe Gail Honeyman, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Sally. Sounds excellent. I can't wait to get my hands on that. I love a nice thriller, and I definitely agree. Like, I can be mean to my sister, but I will fight somebody over my sister if they're mean to her. So, gotcha. All right, so up next we have Laurie Frankel. She's also a best-selling author of 3 novels and was recently named one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle. That's a big deal. She'll be talking about her 4th novel, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I know this is so weird. I'm sort of bummed because this was your big experiment about being like one California, and you are one California, but it's been so different than anyone imagined. I know it's really hard to stay all the way to the last session. I appreciate your being here. And I guess the other thing I want to say is I miss you all. Even without actually knowing exactly who you are, I have not ever in my life before now gone 6 months without being in a bookstore. I've never gone 6 weeks without being in a bookstore. I don't usually go 6 days without being in a bookstore. So I miss you all, and I miss your books, and I miss wandering around. I can't wait to be back. And I appreciate you're doing this. I don't have an ARC. They're doing ARC giveaways, which makes me think they exist, but I don't have one. So look, I have it on this works, right? Because it's technology. This is what it looks like. Isn't it pretty? It's a very nice autumnal cover. I can't take credit for anything on it. Of course, I didn't design the cover. I didn't actually name the book. This is my 4th novel. I've titled not a single novel so far. So like, I fingers crossed for number 5. Of course, I can't take credit for my name because my parents picked it out. But it is really pretty. Anyway, that's to say thank you, and I'm really glad we're doing this. And this is my first for this book. This is the first time I'm talking about it. I finished it on Sunday at like 11:55 p.m. I just finished final edits. So in some ways I've been doing this for 3 years, and in some ways I feel kind of new to it. Some books write easy and some books write hard, and this book wrote really hard. I've been doing it for almost 3 years. It's called 1, 2, 3, a title which, as I say, I didn't make up, but I do love, among other things, because I think it's easy to remember, which is great. And my super, it's been a long time since I've been on a date. So this idea of speed dating is taking me a little while to get my head around it. My super short elevator pitch, like if we were only going to be on the elevator together for a floor, it is also about sisters. It's about triplets, teenage triplet sisters in a small town with a dark past that turns out not to be so dark after all. So that was my teeny pitch. And my like slightly longer pitch is that they live downstream from a chemical plant that 20 years ago, before they were born, was polluting their water. And therefore, these girls and everyone else in the town have some pretty significant challenges dealing with the aftermath of that environmental disaster and corporate malfeasance. And then when it turns out not to be a thing of the past so much as a thing of the present, these girls have to take matters into their own hands. So it's about the ways in which our daughters will save us all. So it's got that thing going. In January 2016, there was an article in the New York Times about a town not completely like this, which was the inspiration for the movie Dark Waters. And that movie is really based on that article. The book I have written is not remotely based on that article, but it was the seed of it for me. It was the inspiration for me. It was made me start to think that it was a good and an interesting story to tell. I feel like when these places are in the news, what you always hear about them is, like you have doctors and they come out and they say, oh, there might be long-term impacts here. It's going to be terrible for these children. They're going to grow up with all sorts of problems, or they might. And then that crisis is over and we've moved on to the next thing, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So I thought, well, what happens next? What does it look like in these towns 20 years later? And what does it mean for all of us, and truly, really all of us, to be living downstream from companies that are putting all sorts of stuff in our water? So that's one of the things that it's about. Saying that out loud, though, it sounds to me like it's really kind of a downer, and it isn't. Really, I think it is a very hopeful book and a very loving book. It is about these three sisters and their relationships with one another, and how they live together and support one another, very different from one another. They unfortunately all insisted on narrating, so it's a waltz. That's the 1, 2, 3. They narrate in turns in the round. In the first person, in the present tense, none of which is my inclination. Very much inclined to be writing in the third person and in the past tense, and from a single point of view. And so that's why it took 3 years to write this book. And it feels in so many ways like 3 years was so long ago, because gosh, it feels like 3 weeks was so long ago. And people have been asking me lately, as I started talk about like the process of writing, and I just think, I mean, gosh, who can say? Because I started this book in a really completely different world than I'm finishing it in, and I'm learning to write when there is no school and my kid never leaves the house, and all of those things. So it's definitely been a journey. I will say, though, that getting to do these things virtually has been fantastic. Getting to do events this way is really, really fun. Because it means you get to sort of see a lot more people, even if you only see them virtually. Just seeing people on screen has become so exciting when I don't leave my house for weeks at a time. So I'm really, thrilled to be there and to see you all. I've been doing lots of book clubs, and that's really fun. In any case, it is my pleasure to be doing this. I am very, very grateful to all of you. I hope it will be a good book for these times. I hope that it will be empowering and uplifting, and also give book clubs lots to talk about, and also be something that everyone can relate to. I mean, isn't that what everybody always hopes for their books? But I hope that it is the case. And mostly, I am so grateful to you all for being here and for being open. And I'm really glad to join you in this endeavor.
Oh, Laurie, thank you. That was very great. Your energy, I can feel it. I like it. Very positive. It's great. I mean, it's great. Trust me, we need some of that positive energy. All right. So up next, we've got Sarah Gailey. They are Hugo Award-winning author, and they're here to talk about their book, The Echo Wife.
Thank you, Melanie. I am, like everyone else, I am so thrilled to be here. I've seen a couple of familiar names and faces and a lot of new ones, and I'm so excited to get to talk to you all. Like Melanie said, I'm here to introduce The Echo Wife, my upcoming novel. But before I introduce The Echo Wife, my upcoming novel, I'm going to talk a little bit, because I have a captive audience, about how much I love independent bookstores. Some of you have heard this story before, so please feel free to like refill your gin and tonic or talk to your cat while I'm saying this, but I try and say it as often as possible. I grew up split between two places, and one of those places was the Alameda County Library in California, in the town where I grew up, and the other one was the stockroom of my mom's independent bookstore that she worked at. Giant Steps Books and Toys. It was focused only on children's literature, and I was like the Phantom of the Opera of that bookstore. They would put me in the back room so that my mom could actually live her life and, you know, work a job and be a human being without a little gnome clutched to her leg. And I would, you know, draw and color and rifle through the books to find galleys that I wasn't supposed to have, that were too old for me to read. I definitely remember spending a good amount of time trying to figure out which books might have dirty words in them. I did not succeed as often as I hoped to, but that was so formative for me. And, you know, last year, in the long ago, before times of 2019, when I was promoting my debut novel, Magic for Liars, I was fortunate enough to visit a lot of independent bookstores for those promotions for book events. And in most of them, I got to like take a little minute in the green room of the stock room. And I would go into the stock rooms of these independent bookstores all across the country and take a deep breath and just breathe in that stressed out, there's so many books in so many piles and we're not totally sure where they are. This is where we keep the paperwork, but our filing system got tipped over by the bookstore cat, and so it's all everywhere. I got to breathe that in, that smell and that feeling, and just realize that I was home. So since I've got, you know, your ears right now, I just want to say thank you for everything that you do and for everything that you are to your communities and to readers and to authors. But thank you also for giving us homes everywhere you are. Your bookstores are homes to readers, but they're also homes to writers. And I personally am so thankful every time I walk into an independent bookstore and feel that sense of home and peace. And wow, I miss feeling a sense of peace because it's 2020, which is the year before, this is a good segue, the year before my second adult novel, The Echo Wife, is going to be coming out from Tor Books in February of next year, which will be the year that 2020 is over. I'm very excited for it. The Echo Wife is the story of Evelyn Caldwell, a brilliant scientist who has invented adult duplicative cloning. Adult duplicative cloning is the type of cloning where I could have one independent bookseller here and go boop, and then I have a second identical independent bookseller in a test tube, which lucky me, because as we all know, independent booksellers are the best people to have around. And more of them is better. I'm saying that because we're all together right now and there's a lot of independent booksellers here, so I feel like this is the right audience to hear that. She's invented this adult duplicative cloning technique. It's groundbreaking. Her career is going great, but her personal life is not going so great because she has discovered that her husband is having an affair with a clone of her that he created by stealing her technology so he could have a less threatening version of her. This book has been called Our Relationships, but for Orphan Black. It has also been called Killing Eve meets Westworld meets Stepford Wives. I am so in love with this book that I have written, which, as I'm sure the other authors here know, it can be a hard thing to say after you've been working on a book for a long time. The Echo Wife was very much inspired by my own experience ending a marriage. I was married to a wonderful man who did not steal my intellectual property or try to clone me. He's a lovely, sweet person, but our marriage needed to end. And when it did, unfortunately, the circumstances made it so that I had to leave the state for about a year and move to a town where I knew almost no one. I was pretty much by myself. I was very isolated and very lonely. And for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't defining myself and who I am based on what other people needed and expected of me, because there was no one to need anything or expect anything. I was all on my own. And it was one of the most frightening things I've ever experienced in a very frightening life. Having to find out the answer to the question, who am I, when no one else is trying to provide you with answers, is incredibly difficult and very, very scary. And that was right around the time that I was due to start writing, according to my bonkers spreadsheet with all of my scheduled deadlines. I was due to start writing my second adult novel. And I realized that this was the big question of my life and of so many of the lives of people who I know and love and people who I don't know and don't love, you know, those people exist too, is the question of who am I on my own? Especially for those of us who've been socialized female for a large part of our lives. It's so easy to fall into a pattern of defining ourselves based on what other people need us to be. And with the opportunity to answer that question apart from the needs and demands and expectations of anybody else, I turned into this whole different person who I am now. And I'm a much happier, more complete person. But wow, the process of getting here was bananas. And all of that is in this book. Evelyn and her clone, Martine, have to face those questions too, the questions of who they are, and also the questions of why they are who they are. Adult duplicative clones in this book are programmed through a series of neural conditionings into the people who they're going to be. And the people who make them, the people who they're going to be, have agendas the same way that the parents who raise us have agendas. Sometimes they just want to do their best. Sometimes they want you to be a particular kind of person. And Evelyn and Martine both have to grapple with the question of, okay, without these other people deciding who I am, who am I? And is that the person who I want to be? And is that person a good person or a bad person? I'll tell you for free, the answer to that last one is complicated, just like it probably is with all of us. So anyway, that is The Echo Wife, February of next year from Tor Books. We will make it to February of next year. I truly love this book. I hope you love it too. I hope that it is as good to read as it was harrowing to write. Thank you so, so much for having me.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for sharing that with us. Sounds like a great book. Can't wait to get our hands on that either. All right, so up next we have Michael Farris Smith. He is here to talk to us about Nick. Give me, so as soon as I saw the cover, I was like, Great Gatsby! And that's the one book that I will reread over and over.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, me too. First of all, thanks everybody for having me. It's great to hear people talk about books and talk about bookstores and all those things we've all been missing quite a bit, I think, since it seems like forever. And hopefully we'll get back to normal one day. I know it's been tough on everybody, but, you know, I would just say, you know, hang in there one day at a time, all that kind of stuff. You know, some of you are familiar with Square Books here in Oxford, Mississippi, the legendary bookstore. And I do miss walking in there. I walk by it all the time, but it's hard not to go in and see those guys. And so everyone out there, just hang in there. And believe it or not, I think one day, hopefully, we'll all see each other in bookstores again and at book conferences again and things like that. So it's cool listening to everybody, because one of the things that kind of pops up that's always interesting to me is the notion of identity. And it seems like a lot of us are talking about that now, kind of like where we are in the world, where characters are in the world, how they're trying to fit in or find themselves or figure out who they are. And I would say that had a tremendous amount of weight in my creation and my decision to you know, create the identity of, well, hell, I guess the most famous narrator in American literature, which saying it out loud seems even as crazy as it did when I kind of had the idea for it. My own experience is filled with that, and I think my own experience stays filled with that. I first read Gatsby when I was 20 years old in undergraduate, and I was a phenomenal C+ student across the board, and I read Gatsby, and I remember tossing it aside and thinking, well, I don't know what the big deal is with this book. I don't know why everybody's shoving it down everybody's throat everywhere. And so I kind of dismissed it. Well, 5 years later, the strangest thing happened to me in that I ended up being an expatriate, and I ended up living abroad in Geneva, Switzerland for a while, and then I lived later in Paris for a little while. And the thing that happened to me while I was living abroad, which I think happens to a lot of people, is that I began to kind of look at like my home and the person I was and the people I knew from a great distance. And those things begin to change, and my ideas of like what home was, and like and the habits I'd been in, and the things I'd done, and the things that I believed really came into question. The other big thing that happened during that experience was I started noticing people reading in Europe, and they read on the trains, and they read in the cafes, and they read sitting in the parks. So I decided, what the hell, I think maybe I'll read to kill some hours while I'm sitting around. And I did, and because I wasn't a very good student and didn't really pay much attention, the only names I knew were the really big names. I knew Hemingway, I knew Fitzgerald, I knew Faulkner, I knew Eudora Welty, because I'm from Mississippi, just some of the names that I knew. So I started reading them, and when I started reading Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and I started realizing, well, their characters are sitting in the cafes in Paris, and I'm sitting in the cafes in Paris. And their characters are in the south of France, and their characters are going to the bullfights in Spain, and those are the things I'm doing. And it was very weird that I had to go like literally thousands of miles away from home to be in a foreign country, and then like start to read something that I strangely related to or could find some camaraderie in. And we all know that when we start to read things that really kind of we can touch with personally, how it seems to mean a little bit more to us. So that went on for a couple of years, and I finally came back home to Mississippi, and I was about 29 or 30 years old at that point. And I remember thinking, I think I'm gonna try to write. And one of those reasons I thought to try to write was right before I came home, I read Gatsby again. And this time when I read it, it was a completely different work to me because of what I'd been doing for the last 10 years, the way my ideals had changed, the things I thought about had changed. And I was really interested in it. But still, I put it aside again. And so we had to go to the third reading. We fast forward 12, 13 more years, and my first novel, Rivers, has come out, and I'm sitting around thinking of what to do next. And I happen to look over my bookshelf, and I see Gatsby, and I think, well, it's short. Maybe I'll read it again, because I don't really remember anything about it. And I picked it up and read it. And this time when I read it, like every page seemed to speak to me in some way that I really wasn't expecting. And when you get to the end and Nick realizes it's his birthday and he's 30 years old, and he thinks, I'm facing a decade of loneliness. I'm facing a decade, he calls it the end of the portentous menacing road. He's not very excited about his 30s. And I just immediately kind of look back to 13, 14 years ago when I came home from Europe. I was about to turn 30. In my time being gone, all my friends had done things like gotten married, have children, buy houses, get jobs. Some of them are actually getting married again. And here I was like a real stranger to them, and my parents had moved from my hometown. They weren't even there anymore. Like I felt like an alien. And here I was saying, I'm going to try to write. And I didn't even really know what that meant. And I really thought about that moment and how I felt when I was on the edge of turning 30. And then I thought about all the things that had happened since I'd done it, from that point to the time I was reading Gatsby Now. And I had started trying to write. I'd, like we all done, gone through years of rejection and failure. I'd thrown away tons of words. I finally had a little success. I'd gotten married. I'd had 2 daughters. I'd been through a whole lot of different things. And just, I don't know, it just really spoke to me in a way I wasn't expecting. And I finished the book and I put it aside, and I realized I had a lot in common with Nick Carraway, and I started thinking about it. And I was like, but I don't really know anything about him. I know he's turning 30. I know he's from the Midwest. I know he was in the war, and that was really all I knew. And the thought crossed my mind, it'd be really cool if someone were to write a novel about Nick Carraway. And it was one of those moments where, like before you finish the thought, you realize you've gotten yourself into something you really don't know if you have any business getting into. And yeah, that's how it hit me. And right away, within like 45 seconds, I realized if you're going to do this, you're probably going to put a big target on your back. That's fine. But you can either embrace it and find joy in it and do it with everything you got, or you can be scared of it and you can back away and wonder for the rest of your life if you should have done it or not. And for me, that was a pretty easy decision. And I think everybody, in this chat, and everybody writing has those conversations with themselves. It takes a lot of guts to put anything on the page. So I just decided to do it. And I dove in. The flip side of that is the year was 2015 when I did that. I wrote it. I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't tell my agent. I didn't tell my editor. I didn't tell anybody because I was afraid if I said what I was doing, they were going to say, that's impossible and you're crazy. And I just didn't want to hear that. None of us like to hear that at any point. So I just turned it in. I just called up my agent and editor one day. I was like, hey, guess what? I got a new book. Oh, really? What's it about? Oh, it's the story of Nick Carraway right before he meets Gatsby. And they were like, you did what? I was like, yeah, and I'm sending it to you. I had no idea that the copyright was not expired and that it couldn't be published for 5 more years. I was completely oblivious to it all. And I'm glad I didn't, because I probably would have quit. I probably would have thought, well, I'll do it later. And we all know how that works out. Everybody read it. We started doing our homework. Couldn't be published until January 1st, 2021. And so for 5 years, I've been sitting here with this book while I've, fortunately kept working and had a few others come out. But it's been a very strange trip. And the strange part of it, and every writer can understand this, every artist, musician can understand this. When I sat down to do the revision last year, I was editing myself from 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And it was a really interesting experience to see the evolution of my writing life, of my voice and the way I use language in those 4 or 5 years. It's been 3 novels in between that. And we just we always continue to evolve and to change. And going back, I was taking, just marking out pages of dialogue. And I remember in one section in particular, I just wrote yuck across the page. I was like, it's as if a different human being had written it. So that has been very part of this very strange journey to get to this book, and actually talking about it now is very kind of weird now after sitting around very quietly on it for so long. So that is the journey of Nick. And I really hope, it'll strike a chord with everybody. I think the thing about it to me was it's about someone who's searching, really searching, and having his life changed in ways he can never see coming. And I think we are always on the edge of that. I mean, we're all in the middle of that right now. I mean, this time last year, who could have predicted what the hell we'd all be going through right now? Yeah. So you never know what's around the corner. And Nick was around the corner for me. And, I just hopped on and held on as hard as I could.
That's great. Well, thank you, Michael. I can't wait to get my hands on that. I like all of these books. Yeah, you do have a target on your back, and now I know you, so I'll find you after I read it, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last author for today, certainly not our least, but our last one, is Kendra Atleework. She'll be here she's here to talk about her memoir, Miracle Country.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kendra Atleework, and this is Miracle Country. It's my debut, and it was published by Algonquin in July. And it's a memoir, actually. But it's kind of an unusual memoir because it has a 500 source bibliography on my website, but it is a memoir still. It's a love letter to my family. It's a love letter to my home in California, and it's a love letter to California at large. And so the story of my family and the story of the place where we come from, our part of California and California in general, are inextricable to me. If you were to have put me somewhere else to grow up, even 2 hours away, I would be unrecognizable to myself entirely. And so I had to write this book. It's the product of my 20s. It took 6 years. And I'm so grateful to indie booksellers for how much they've been supporting it since it came out in July. Publishing during a pandemic has really highlighted the importance of indie booksellers to me. I live in Bishop, California, and our local bookstore, Spellbinder, just saved me this summer. They have an entire wall devoted to Miracle Country. They threw a masked signing in the park for me when it came out, which was the only in-person event I got to do. So thank you for the work that you do, and I hope to someday get to meet more of you in person. I might have met some of you at Winter Institute, but someday we will travel again. So Miracle Country tells the story of the Eastern Sierra Nevada and my family's life there. The town I live in is my hometown. It's the town where I was born. It's in between Yosemite and Death Valley. So it's desert and mountain. And it's a very small town. We have to drive 4 or 5 hours to get to an airport or a Costco. It's the kind of town where we argue with various other little towns, mostly in the South, about who's really the mule capital of the world. We're determined that we are. It's the kind of place where if you're standing to wait to cross the street at Main Street at a red light, you're gonna see, I've seen this more than once, people parked passing snacks back and forth or people waiting at the light, passing their snacks to each other across between car windows. So everybody knows everybody. It's just a classic little small town. And my parents were both drawn to this place independently in their 20s. My dad lived in the burned down shell of a restaurant when he was first living out here because he didn't have to pay rent. So the windows had been blown out by fire. It was so cold at night, he would drag his cot into the walk-in freezer because that was the warmest place to sleep. And he pumped gas at the little tiny county airport. And eventually he was a hot air balloon pilot because it's a tourist town. It's a weird economy. It's hard to make a living here. Meanwhile, my mom was a teacher who one time cross-country skied 18 miles over avalanche debris to feed the class hamsters. And she was a search and rescue volunteer. They would bury her under the snow to practice avalanche rescue. And so they were interesting people, and they met here, and they raised my brother and sister and I to love the place. Even though it's kind of a wild place. We get fires. I mean, today's one of the only days I've been able to go outside in weeks because the smoke has been so bad, but you all know how that's been. So can't even talk to Northern California about that this summer. But anyways, we often have natural disaster. We have flood, we have fire, we have blizzards. We get 0 to 10 average inches of rainfall every year, sometimes closer to 0. So it's really dry. And my parents raised us to love it anyways. My childhood was spent chasing lizards and learning how to not get bit by rattlesnakes and black widow spiders in the brush, living 30 minutes from a town halfway up the Sierra Nevada mountains. So when I was 16, my mom died, and suddenly this place that had once been the source of all the meaning and the magic and the beauty in the world became empty, and I just wanted to leave. So I left. I abandoned my dad, who was suddenly a single parent of 3 teenagers, and my brother, who slipped into petty crime, and my sister, who found the role of small town party girl. And I took off for a decade. And while I was gone, I was totally consumed by homesickness. I lived in LA, I lived in San Diego, and I lived in Minneapolis. And I started researching about the place that I left behind, the place I thought I avoided actively and never dreamed I would live in again. Miracle Country opens with a wildfire that burned 1/3 of the houses in my hometown in February of 2015. That was in the heart of the California drought, which you'll all remember. This was February. We were supposed to have been under several feet of snow up on the mountainside at that time, but it was the drought, and these crazy winds fanned this fire up the mountain. My brother tries to go back into the neighborhood on a back road to save the house. His truck gets stuck. He runs from the wildfire. The wind is knocking him over. So this happened when I was in the middle of researching and writing about home. I spent a night sitting on the floor surrounded by pictures of my house and my mom, and I was imagining my entire neighborhood burning. I flew home on a red eye. I sifted through the ash with neighbors while the ground was still warm from the fire. And I knew at that point, I knew I had to move home despite the danger. So Miracle Country is the story of homecoming in the face of danger. It's the story of my understanding of our attachment to place and how that can shape us. I chose to come back to a home that was really troubled and perilous. I bought a house in Bishop, my hometown, and I live there now. I live 1 mile from my brother and 2 miles from my dad, and I'm gonna stick around. We're all shaped by our homes, and we're gonna start seeing those homes get more and more imperiled as the climate changes. But I find hope when we dig in our heels. I find hope in the volunteer firefighter who saved my house while his own house burned. And that's what I wanted to share in Miracle Country. We see our loss and our grief manifested in our beloved landscapes. But when we stay and when we do the hard work and when we commit to our homes and our communities, that's all we can do. And that's what gives me hope. So thank you so much, Indie Booksellers, for nominating Miracle Country for the August Indie Next Picks. That was really moving to me to read those blurbs that you wrote. And since Miracle Country's out, if you do have book clubs that want to discuss it, I would be happy to video chat in, and those folks can get in touch with me on my website. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Kendra. Well, I think that's it for everything, right?
Thank
We're
you,
done.
everyone. What
Thank you.
an auspicious end to our first ever Discovery Lab for the whole state of California. Thank you all for being part of it.